I'm Daniel Veksler, and I'm here to help you understand Russia better and without bias. There's a fascinating history of meetings between the leaders of Russia and the United States. Russia is 4.5 times the age of the United States, and the United States had existed as an independent country for 169 years before a meeting between its leader and the leader of Russia ever took place. The first meeting was between the communist monarch of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was then approaching his fourth consecutive presidential run, which he would also win. Roosevelt was the only president in US history to serve more than the constitutionally specified maximum 2 terms in office. The meeting between Stalin and Roosevelt took place in the Irani capital Tehran, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was there too. It was the middle of World War II, and Stalin was in his 3rd year of fighting off the Nazi forces which had attacked the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would lose 27 million of its citizens by the end of the war, but the Red Army would take Berlin. These giants of mid-20th century politics met to finally plan the intervention of the United States in the war, which wouldn't take place for another half a year. The conditions they began to agree on there were to constitute the new world order after the war was over, a world order that became known as the Cold War. It's fascinating to consider that Roosevelt and Churchill were both from aristocratic families, while Stalin was an ethnic minority. The ruler of more than 1/6 of the dry land on the planet was the son of an illiterate alcoholic cobbler from a remote town in Georgia. More meetings would take place between the 3 leaders. At one of them, they founded the UN. However, by the time the end of the war came in late spring of 1945, Roosevelt had died suddenly, and Churchill had been voted out of Parliament. Stalin had to manage the end of the war with Harry Truman, who dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan that same year, and Clement Attlee, a man who was Churchill's direct opponent in the British Parliament. The 2 men seemed never to have heard of many of Stalin's agreements with Roosevelt and Churchill. In 1959, Nikita Khrushchev met with Dwight D. Eisenhower several times during his visit to the United Nations General Assembly. Khrushchev's dramatic antics at the UN went down in history as, among other things, he banged his shoe on the podium during his speech. At the time, the Cold War was well underway, and the West was demanding that the USSR reveal its nuclear weapons program. Khrushchev's famous phrase, which was popularly translated as "we'll bury you," was really a Russian idiom that meant "we'll show you," as in, you want to see our nuclear weapons? If you keep threatening us, we'll show you where they are. Nevertheless, both Khrushchev and Eisenhower reiterated many times that they believed only in diplomatic solutions to the 2 countries' differences. In his farewell speech the following year, televised right before he left office to be replaced by JFK, Eisenhower would warn Americans against escalating the Cold War and to be wary of the military-industrial complex, a term he coined. 2 years before their meeting, Khrushchev's USSR had sent the first satellite into space. A year and a half after it, the Soviet Union would send the first man into orbit, prompting JFK to promise Americans a moon landing within 10 years. In 1962, Khrushchev and JFK would manage the Cuban Missile Crisis together over the phone, and the world would survive. We'll talk about that crisis another time on Understand Russia. In 1972, Richard Nixon made one of his famous trips into enemy territory when he visited Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow. The 2 leaders signed several documents limiting military proliferation on both sides. The 2 men were civil, but distrusted each other. Experienced worldly men, when they met face to face, they must have recognized each other's worst qualities. Under Brezhnev, the Red Army reached its maximum size. In the late 70s, it numbered almost 8 million soldiers. That's when the USSR entered Afghanistan to fight against the terrorist regime that involved Osama bin Laden. Remember the Kalashnikov machine gun bin Laden always had slung over his shoulder in his videos? He took that personally off a dead Russian soldier. That war would be extremely destructive and would last 10 years. Join us next time for part 2 of the history of meetings between US leaders and Russian leaders on Understand Russia.